Hey everybody, it's Dr. Kopp. How you doing? What we're going to talk about now is designing for learning in the metaverse. But basically, what I want to talk about today is really VR design and development. So if we think about the definition of the metaverse, which is kind of an integration of all kinds of technologies. I always joke that I think when Mark Zuckerberg said, "Oh, we're changing our company to Meta," everyone who had even thought about the metaverse all of a sudden was like, "Okay, we're going to add our technology." So, Bitcoin is part of the metaverse. Oh, AI is part of the metaverse. Oh, VR is part of the metaverse. Oh, AR is part of the metaverse. So they kind of combined all of it. But if we go back to Neil Stephenson's original definition in 1992 in his book Snow Crash, the definition really was a virtual reality environment. And as instructional designers, those of us who design instruction, we're going to be asked often to develop in the metaverse in VR. So let's talk about what that means and what that looks like. So first of all, last summer when I taught this course, it was a virtual gold rush, right? It was people who were buying all kinds of things. They bought a virtual yacht for $650,000. Like everybody was speculating land in the metaverse. People were buying into the metaverse. People were going metaverse crazy, right? And then the bottom kind of fell out, right? Back in March, Microsoft shut down their VR platform, AltSpace VR. And I know a lot of people had put a lot of effort and items in there. It was actually a pretty cool environment. Gone. Then Meta's Horizon World reportedly struggling to keep users, right? People were not active there. People were not doing things in the metaverse. And so people kind of have lost interest. And Mark Zuckerberg's metaverse vision is over, but Apple has recently come out with a new set of goggles, and some people say that the metaverse is going to be saved by Apple's new goggles. Now, I don't know if that's true. I don't know if everyone's kind of going into the metaverse now that Apple has put out. They're still pretty pricey. It's about $3,500. So that price will drop, but that's a little pricey for what people kind of want to pay. So that may not be there. But the idea of using, as we saw Anders last week, the idea of using 3D virtual environments is not going away. There is still going to be a need for these environments. Maybe it's not called the metaverse. Maybe it's not quite as metaversey as the hype says it will be, but we as instructional designers need to think about designing for these virtual environments. And if we take the good old traditional ADDIE model, we can think about creating these environments following some kind of analysis, a design, development, implementation, and evaluation. And the really interesting thing, I think, is that we're going to have to analyze a little bit differently than we did before. We're going to have to design and think a little bit differently than before. Develop, again, a little bit differently. So there's a lot of different things that we are going to have to think about as we create this instruction. So we're going to probably need a design team. And again, as Anders said, you're going to have programmers, you're going to have graphic artists, instructional designers, subject matter experts. Now, the thing that I think is interesting about this is when e-learning first became on the scene, and unfortunately I'm old enough to remember that, there were programmers, graphic artists, instructional designers, subject matter experts, a team of people required to build the course. Now, not so much, right? You don't need a programmer because a lot of the, you need somebody to use an authoring tool, but a lot of the authoring tools are really, really simple. So you don't have to spend a lot to do that. Second of all, you can get a lot of graphics, and now with AI, you can kind of generate graphics as well. So you don't need quite as much of that. But with VR, you still do. Eventually, those tools are all going to become more simpler. LearnBright, which we're going to see, is already a fairly simple tool. Second Life is a simple tool. we're going to look at Decentraland. All these are fairly simple. So right now you'll still kind of need a team, but you won't need a team forever. So let's look at analysis. So the first thing, if we're going to go with instructional design, we've got to know that what are we trying to teach? And what we need to think about is what is best taught in the metaverse, right? So the metaverse is an environment that right now is still expensive to develop in, time consuming. So we want to make sure that we're using the right environment for the right instruction. So if we're going to teach spelling, the metaverse probably isn't the right environment. But if we wanted to teach reacting in an emergency situation, the metaverse is the right environment. We also want to know why we're going to choose the metaverse over something else. When would you use video versus the metaverse? And again, Anders talked about last time how they're using both video and experiences in the metaverse and combining those, which I think is pretty interesting. And then what tasks can be efficiently taught in the metaverse? So one of the things that I think is really important and really noticeable is the affective domain. That's the sense of emotion. So if you have somebody in a stressful situation, again, maybe handling nuclear materials, if there's uncertainty about how are you going to put together a rescue situation, or fear, like, oh, I'm afraid of interacting in a conflict type situation because I'm not sure that I'm going to do that correctly. Like, all of that is really important for analysis. Now, the other thing that's not mentioned as you look at all of these is cost. And when we had Anders, he was able to tell us that, here's a big, huge piece of equipment that costs a lot of money to take from place to place. And guess what? If we do it virtually, we save a lot of money. And guess what? We get to look inside. So those are important elements as well. So when you look at someone says, hey, we want VR, give us VR, or we want metaverse, give us metaverse, look at these things. Are you trying to impact their emotions? Because being immersed in the environment impacts emotion. Are you going to require group coordination? We saw some things with Anders, right? We had groups working together. That becomes important. Are you going to require real-time interaction? Do you want people working together to accomplish a goal? Do you want them to do it under pressure? Do you want both individual and group? Again, Anders talked about that, how we have both individual and group performance, and he could evaluate both of those types of performances, which is really important. And is rehearsal potentially dangerous or costly? Like we already talked about the cost of hauling that stuff from here to there, but also, could somebody get hurt in the real life situation, with the radiation? Yeah, you could. So let's go ahead and not do that. Let's go ahead and do it safely in a VR environment. And if you need a high degree of realism, the wiring diagrams that Anders showed us, I think, make a lot of sense. So when someone tells you, hey, we need to have VR, start to ask them questions related to these items to see if they really want VR to make sense. So let me give you an example. We were working with a company on DE&I, and they wanted to have an immersive diversity, equity experience, right? So they wanted people to experience being different cultures and different colors and different religions and all kinds of different a variety of ways of being diverse, right? All kinds of different types of diversity, and there's all kinds of diversity, right? And so they wanted to develop this immersive environment, and they wanted to give everybody a headset. And they had over 100,000 employees. And we said to them, if we do this in an immersive environment, which is, a good way to do this, with no content at all, you're talking millions of dollars with 100,000 employees and, 400, 500, 1,000 a headset. And that's without any content. Do you really want to do this? And they're like, no, that doesn't make sense. And we're like, no, it really doesn't, because of the cost. So let's do video. Video can be very emotional, very effective. Let's do the video, right? So you need to be careful as a designer of instruction how you lead your client. You're a professional. You are telling them what they need to know. You want to be very careful about being a good steward of time, money, and safety. So that's why analysis makes sense. Also look at analysis, people make bad decisions. So you want to put them in an environment where it's okay to make the bad decision safely, as opposed to a bad decision in front of a client, on a skyscraper, working with radioactive material, wiring electricity. People get mad. People say stupid things. Pressure can dull the senses. Real-time interactions add pressure. So all of these, look for these types of elements in the design of your instruction. Are you doing people-to-people interactions? Yes, okay, that might be a candidate. Are you making instruction where bad decisions are costly or expensive or dangerous? That might be a good thing for a virtual reality environment. You want an environment where people get mad. So military uses VR a lot. Why? Well, because when you're getting shot at, it changes you, right? It has pressure, you get upset, you get mad, you sometimes get irrational, and you make dumb decisions, right? And dumb decisions in a military environment, unfortunately, can get you injured or killed. So you need to practice being under fire in a situation as realistically as possible and control your emotions, right? So look for these kinds of interactions. And so what are some good examples? Well, an emergency room is a good example of a VR environment. Team selling, combat I mentioned, first responders, compliance, right, where you could cut off your compliance and safety, or you could cut off a hand if you're not careful, or worse. Event planning and coordination, right? You have a huge event going on. You want to coordinate all these activities of all these people all over, multiple scenarios, security, buildings, ports, all kinds of things. So Anders gave us some great examples as well, working with radioactive material he talked about. Experience what it's like to work on a job, experience what it's like to walk into a big air handling system. So all of this can be really important and helpful. Okay, so you've done the analysis, you've looked at it, and you said, you know what, this does make sense from an instructional technology perspective. So now I need to design the learning experience. So what's different in VR is you're designing the learning experience rather than slides, rather than branching scenarios. So you're designing the entire experience. So you've got to figure out, like, where does this experience take place? Is it several locations? Is it, in an office building? Is it on the street? Is it at a construction site, or is it all three? Right? How realistic do you need it to be? So I thought it was kind of interesting. If you looked at the diagram that Anders showed us, 100% realistic, right? Total realism there. That was the actual diagram. Painting in the building, we saw the heads and the floating hands doing it, kind of slapping on the paint. A little less realistic, but still, you had the sense of being there. And one of the things that I often say about the human ability to suspend disbelief. So as humans, we are really good at, we can read black and white letters on a piece of paper, and it can evoke emotion. We can cry, we can laugh, we can be upset, right? We read a book and we can picture it, right? So we, as designers of instruction, it's nice to do 100% realistic, but we don't have to be, right? We can give the sense of painting a building, the sense of this big piece of machinery, and that can be enough from a learning perspective. So you also need to think about what needs to be created. What kind of assets do we need that are different or special for this environment that might not be in other environments? So again, a lot of LearnBright, which we'll talk about, that's got a lot of stuff already in the can, if you will. You just drag it in and you have it and you're good to go. So that's great. Then you need to figure out what objects are you going to manipulate. But you also need to look at it and say, are there any objects for our unique application that don't exist? And do we need to create them? And then can you buy items as well? And we're going to talk about that also. So lots of really interesting places to think about from a design perspective that you wouldn't think about, right? We didn't even talk about the traditional instructional design, like is it, what's the instructional strategy? What's the instructional approach? We didn't talk about that in terms of design. We didn't talk about, that because that's there. It's part of basic instructional design, no matter what technology you design for, basic instructional design. But these go beyond basic instructional design. And then you need to think about the sequencing. Like when you go into a virtual world, you got to figure out like, well, where do the people land in the virtual world? Where do they enter the world? How do they interact with the experience? Are we going to give them, am I going to be there telling them what to do? Are you going to use videos like Anders indicated? Are you going to use text floating in the air to tell them what to do? How are you going to get learners to start interacting? And then think about what are the desired learning outcomes. Are you going to be very, with Anders, it was very procedural, step by step by step, and very specific. You need to learn how to handle this radioactive material. That's an example. Or you need to learn how to wire this diagram. But let's go to more, sometimes they call them the softer skills, like negotiation skills or sales skills or leadership skills, right? What's the desired outcome of doing a leadership simulation in a virtual world? What do you want people to think about, reflect upon, learn from being in that experience? And then, we talked about this with Anders. How do you add pressure elements? Time. He showed, again, with the diagram example, right? First time takes about an hour, and then at the end, you have this race to see how fast you can do it. That's a great way to think about time and to focus people on time. And then how realistic do you want the actions? Again, we talked about the painting. We talked about the diagramming. We talked about the handling nuclear material. You want it to be as realistic as you possibly can. So here's an example of a helicopter in Second Life. We saw some great examples from Anders, but this is actually a snapshot of the cockpit of the actual helicopter. So that's a high level of fidelity. So if you're training on this helicopter, that would be a good thing to have. If you're just using helicopter to get your character from one place to another, or you're not the pilot, you might not need that level of fidelity. But if you're training, okay, this is what you need to know to operate this helicopter, kind of like a flight simulator, you want it to be as realistic as possible. And the nice thing about the metaverse environment is you can bring in realistic images, you can bring in realistic pictures and make it as realistic as you need to. Now, there's a certain 2D-ness to this. By bringing in a photograph, that does give you 100% fidelity. What it doesn't give you, however, is the depth of it. And oftentimes, you're not able to manipulate a photograph. So, if you have switches or buttons or things like that, you're going to have to program them in on top of the image. So a lot of times, this is where your multimedia developer are going to come in. Like you could say, hey, yeah, I can take a picture of the inside of the helicopter digitally, no problem. But then how do you make sure the altimeter works correctly? How are you going to make sure, all the horizon, all that stuff. So you're going to be working very closely with programmers as a designer of instruction to make sure that the experience feels real in the virtual environment. You've got to design it so it feels real enough to get across the learning objectives. And then you might want to design a debrief for the learning experience. I always say that there's no learning without reflection. There's only an experience. So if we really want to make sure somebody's having, the right experience, what we want to do is really design that experience. And so we might want things like, who's going to conduct the debriefing? Will it be the instructor? Will it be a subject matter expert? If it's a subject matter expert, maybe they need coaching on how to do the debriefing. Maybe it's a peer-to-peer debriefing. Like, how's that going to work? You want to think about that before you just throw people into the digital environment. And, Anders said, as he showed, people were having debriefings. People were talking about their information. And then what will be the focus of the debriefing? Are we going to focus on mistakes that people made? Are we going to focus on the behaviors? Are we going to focus on what to do next? All that kind of stuff. And then if you are going to evaluate this at any level, like how did the learner perform, how are you going to calculate the score? How are you going to tell if the learner did it right, and then how are you going to give them feedback? Remember, Anders said, hey, we can track just about everything, but do we really want to track just about anything? Probably not. So what are the most important elements that should be tracked, that should be evaluated, that should be looked at as you think about this design debriefing? So that becomes a really important element as well. Then once you look at that, whoops, I'm going the wrong way. Let's go the right way here. Then you need to develop it. So basically storyboarding in the 3D world and what elements go into the world. So you're going to have to think about things like what platform are we using? Things like what technology is available to the learners. You need to think about what do you have 3D modelers? Are you gonna have to buy this stuff? Like, where are you gonna get this 3D environment? I'm gonna use the stuff that already exists in the world, or do I need to find other things? And that becomes really important to consider. So you want to think about things like, what do the learners know? How do the learners know what to do? So that seems simple, right? How do learners know what to do? And why that is important is because are they all going to know how to operate in a 3D environment? So in a 2D environment, we're all used to working online. We know how to do that. That's no problem. But some learners, when they come to a 3D environment, aren't going to know how to turn their characters. They're not going to know how to look around, how to look behind them, all that kind of stuff. So you're going to have to give them some instructions. Are you going to give them text-based instructions, audio-based instruction? Are you going to be there? And a neat thing you can do in the virtual world is you can say, does the world talk to the learners? So what does that mean? Does the world talk to the learners? And what I mean by that is you could click on a coffee mug, you could click on a table, you could click on a piece of machinery, and it could give you information. And it could give you text-based information, it could give you a video, so if you want the world to interact and talk to the learners, that's something that you would want to put together. Now, if you don't want the world to talk to learners, if you want to coach them through it, because in the real world, the world doesn't talk to you, not without augmented reality, which is a whole other subject, but typically in the real world, the world doesn't talk to you. So do you want it to be like that way and have a coach or the trainer walk you through that process? So maybe the world doesn't talk to the learners, right? And those are development decisions that you're going to have to consider when you create the instruction. It becomes very important to consider that and to think about it. And then finally, implementation. I already talked about that example of the DE&I where you're, hey, we want to do VR for 100,000 employees, right? You run into some logistical coordinate, like how are you even going to get the goggles to all 100,000 employees? And then what if somebody doesn't get the goggles, or what if they don't want to wear the goggles, and all kinds of stuff. And then what kind of technology? I did a 3D virtual world one time for a pharmaceutical company. And I said, okay, what are your technical specs for your computers that people are going to be using this on? Because we need to know the technical specs. So they gave me the technical specs, but they gave me the specs for the computers that they were currently buying, which made sense. But what they didn't tell me was about 2/3 of the workforce that needed this training didn't have those computers yet. They weren't getting the new computers for quite some time. So the old ones didn't run it very well. So we ran into that problem. They didn't have the right graphic card. Then people who had been issued the new computers kept calling into the help desk. Hey, my computer is making a weird noise every time I run this training program. What is it? I don't want something to happen to my computer. Well, it turns out that a little bit of computer knowledge here. It turns out that when a computer graphic card runs and it runs a little hot, it kicks on the fan. So computer kicks on the fan to cool off the computer. And this is quite some time ago, but it kicked off the fan and cooled off the computer, which is exactly what you want the computer to do. Because when it heats up, you want it to cool off. You don't want to overheat a computer, so the fan kicks on. Well, these people didn't use any other application that ever heated up their computer to the level where the fan kicked on. So this one application that we did for them, this 3D virtual experience, kicked on the fan. And then they're like, hey, it's making a weird noise, right? So that's a technical issue. We needed to then brief people about, hey, when you run this program, here's what's going to happen. You have to be aware that the fan is going to run. Seems like a little thing, seems like a simple thing, but it's not. This is things people need to know when they run the instructions. So implementation is not as simple as you think. You have to spend a lot more time with a virtual reality implementation process than with e-learning, right? E-learning, you load it up to the LMS, boom, you're off, you're good. For VR, if you're really going to do VR, like how are they going to get the goggles? Are they going to share the goggles? If they're going to share the goggles, how do we ensure good hygiene, right? People wipe off the goggles, clean the goggles. Where do they keep the goggles? In an academic environment, and maybe even in a corporate, like how do you check in and check out the goggles, right? How do you keep track of these? These things are not cheap. We don't want to lose those goggles. So how do we make sure that we can track those goggles? Do they have to go somewhere to get these goggles? Like all of that kind of stuff, you've got to think about from implementation. So there's a lot of logistics to coordinate. And I always urge people, whenever you do a VR project for a company, and especially if it's the first time that group or division or company has done VR, or maybe it's an academic department, whatever, is you have got to take the time and run a pilot. Test out your assumptions. Take the lowest common denominator and see if it works on their computer, or see if they are using goggles, or see if all those kind of things. See how they check in and check out equipment already. I mean, you've got a lot of considerations to make sure that this is going to work and work properly. And then finally, we're going to evaluate it, right? We're going to evaluate it on several different levels. You might debrief people, like, how did you feel about that? What would you do differently? What did you like? What didn't you like? All that kind of stuff. Scoring, hey, you properly were able to handle the radioactive material, or you properly wired the diagram, and then how are you going to grade that? Is 100% the only way? Like if you're working with radioactive material, I would think yes. But if it's not radioactive, is there some other course of success, like A, B, C, D, or something like that, or satisfactory, excellent? What does that happen to be? Okay, and so now we'll think about like why we have 3D learning, and we've been talking about it. I always want you to think about the question you always want to ask people is why 3D for learning? Now, there's great answers. There are fantastic answers. But I think as professionals, if we can challenge people and say, well, why do you think this should be virtual reality environment or 3D environment? They might say, oh, because of this and this and this. You might say, yeah, perfectly makes sense. Or they might say, I mean, this seems weird, but I've been in organizations or consulting with organizations, and they want 3D because it's cool. Like, you might not come out and say, oh, it's cool, but hey, we want to be seen as a forefront. We want on the latest. That's not a good reason to do VR. You've got to go back to the learning. What learning outcome do you want? Always start and end with the learning outcome. That's a sign of a professional. Now, let's talk about like some reasons why we as professionals would think about 3D learning, or describe to somebody why they would want 3D learning. So one thing is it allows for a creation of what's called a sense of self. When you go into a 3D environment, you are able oftentimes to craft your own persona, your own avatar. And this is a screen capture from the LearnBright tool. And notice I can change my hair, my top, my bottom, my shoes, my skin, my eyes, my face, all kinds of things. And I used to think this was unimportant. Like, who cares? Just get in there and do what you need to do. But the interesting thing about this is that research has shown that people, the more they're able to customize their avatar, the more it's an extension of themselves. And if we want people to act and interact in the virtual environment as an extension of themselves, we've got to give them time to create themselves, to customize their avatar, to play with the avatar, to allow the avatar and them to form a relationship. I know it sounds like really weird, and it sounds like, Carl, Dr. Cobb, this is like a digital avatar. It doesn't matter, but it does matter. In fact, there's been some research showing that people keep the same physical distance with their avatars as they do in real life. So Americans keep a little bit further distance than Europeans or than Asians, right? It's really kind of wild. There's no reason. You're in the virtual environment. You're not in, there's been research where, somebody bumps into you, you're like, ouch, or that was rude. Well, it's not rude. It's a virtual environment. It doesn't matter. But we put our sense of physicality into our character, our avatar, and into the world around us. Oftentimes, it's so immersive that if our character, like, even just bumps into a wall, we're like, we react, even though it's our character. It's not physically hurting us. It's on the screen. So it becomes very important to create this sense of self, because what that does then is that helps with the emotion, right? If you're so wrapped up in your character and your character is having an argument with somebody, you can get pretty upset, or your character is in danger, your heart rate increases. You start to perspire a little bit. Even though you're safely behind your computer screen or safely behind your goggles, you feel like you're there. You walk up, if you're wearing goggles and you walk up to the edge of a building and look down, you get scared. So these kinds of experiences happen best when we allow the learner time to create a sense of themselves. So when you're talking to someone about a virtual environment, and they might say, yeah, it doesn't matter, just pick a character and go. No, tell them that there is value in allowing the learner to take some time to develop their own character, especially if you want them to see themselves or to be seen by others, right? So sometimes we've seen just a floating head, so you don't really have a sense of yourself, right? Maybe you could pick your hard hat or something like that. But some in virtual environments that we're going to see is you can kind of see the whole character and you can interact with the character, and you really want the character to be an extension of you. Like, so here's Decentraland, and there's my character with the mohawk, but there's somebody else's character as kind of an angel fairy type of character, and then somebody's more ethereal, like a ghost, right? So giving people chances to create their character, to work with their character, to interact with their character is a really important aspect of creating a virtual experience. Now, another very important element, so you create the right character, but you also have the ability to create the right context, right? So here's a cardiovascular center. So I'm going to be training in surgery. I want to be in a surgical area, right? And so I can immerse somebody in that kind of area, that kind of experience, right? And that can become really important from a learning perspective. I'm in a hospital and I need to interact with different people. Here I'm interacting with the nurse, right? But it feels kind of like a hospital, right? It's got the kind of yucky green walls, and it's got the sterile floors, and it's got the seating, and it's got all that kind of stuff. So one of the things that research has shown us is that transfer of learning happens most effectively when the environment that we practice in is similar to the environment that we actually have to perform in. So think about a lot of training. A lot of training is in a classroom and you're looking at, PowerPoint slides, if it's live person-to-person training. Or we're looking at a Zoom and some slides like we are now. But if we actually have to apply the knowledge, wouldn't it be nice to be in the actual situation so that we can get visual cues, auditory cues? We feel like we're in that actual situation. And that's one of the things VR can do. It can put us in that actual situation, allowing us to tune into those clues, which is really helpful from a learning perspective. So building the right context becomes very important. So here's creating context of a doctor's office. And that can be really helpful. And I'm going to show you a video from Tipping Point. It's included here in the class, which is a video that shows how to actually go into this kind of environment with augmented reality. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. I think it's really kind of a cool way to do that. So let me bring that up. And we'll go in here, and session 3, you're going to see something called a Metaverse learning model. No, that's not it. You're going to see something called, where is it? AR sales simulators. Let's go into that. And this is really cool. It's there, but I'm going to show it here because it just shows you what you can do with augmented reality versus virtual reality. So let's take a look at this. It's only a couple of minutes. Oops, let me share my whole screen here. Technical difficulties. Okay, let's do this.
His new augmented reality sales simulator application. All you need to get started is to take out your phone and open the application. The app uses your phone's built-in camera. This isn't like traditional AR apps that require a target image. Instead, our AR sales simulator scans your environment. When it finds a valid area, a door to our virtual world appears. Once you lock in its location, the door swings open, revealing a doctor's office. Now here's the cool part. You can literally step inside this virtual office. You can look around and interact with the doctor and the patient, just like if you were in a real office. It's just like virtual reality, minus the headset. As you can see, if you turn around and look outside, you're still in your real world environment, but it's been transformed into a virtual setting. You can have conversations with the doctor, and you can meet their patients. Watch as we use voice commands, not button presses, to learn more about Helen. Hey Helen, tell us about yourself.
I'm 68 years old and recently retired from teaching. Now I spend more time with my 2 grandchildren.
And when were you diagnosed?
I was diagnosed 6 months ago.
Helen and her doctor have lots of details about her lifestyle and diagnosis that you can learn about. Using voice controls engage the learners and help them practice their verbalizations, which raises retention rates. We can recreate whatever simulation you need, like patient journeys, role-playing exercises, and sales calls, which take place in our augmented reality virtual offices. You can set this up in your office, living room, bedroom, or basement, wherever you have the floor space to set up a door to your virtual experience. The best part is that everything you're seeing is already built. It's all off-the-shelf assets that you can have customized quick. We have an entire hospital filled with different kinds of doctors, patients, and scenarios, all of which can be interacted with. All we need is your pre-approved content for whatever tool you want, whether it be talking to a patient, a doctor, or...
Okay, so I mean, really kind of cool stuff, and you can look at the whole video or look at that video again in the course material, but that's where you can use augmented reality to feel like virtual reality. So that whole experience is just in your phone, which I think is just kind of a fascinating way to look at and to think about the possibility of the future. You don't need goggles. All you needed was your phone. So that's the right context though, right? If I'm going to practice sales skills, I want to be in the physician's office, because that's where I'm going to be talking to the physician or talking to the patient, or with Anders, we wanted to have that big piece of machinery, or we wanted to be in a place to practice diagramming items, or in a building doing industrial painting, commercial painting. So the right context is really important. And as you heard from that video, having the assets already made or already available becomes really helpful as well, right? So here's a context of a lobby. Maybe you need to have a lobby for information, and then you go to the classroom or you go to the library. Now, one of the things that I don't want you to do is in a virtual reality, and this happens a lot, is, I mean, yes, you need spaces for people to gather, but let's not have a virtual classroom with virtual PowerPoint, and virtual learners. Let's put the learner in the experience where you want them, or it can be a fanciful experience. So here in Decentraland, I'm kind of in the lobby, if you will, of the world, and I can go and check out different items that I want and interact. Here, there's kind of a robot. It's kind of a fantasy world kind of experience. So you can do it that way to kind of maybe orient people and get them comfortable with kind of fanciful things. Some people like that, some people don't. You have to be careful of your audience. And then create the right environment, like the cardiovascular center or the laboratory where you're conducting nuclear experiments on nuclear drugs, radioactive drug, all that kind of thing. You as the designer need to think through that and be careful about how that works. And then you can even leverage role plays. One of the things that happens a lot in a virtual environment is the ability to do a role play. So this is kind of a role play / game. But the thing I really wanted to show you here was on the left-hand side is the evaluation model. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. So what happens with this model? With this model, sorry about that, is that you have certain points. You have points for strategic account planning, points for building partnerships. So when you have this interaction, let's go back here. So when you interact, each of these answers or responses in this particular case is tied to elements of the art of the model on the left, right? Strategic responses, building impactful partnerships, identifying A to B shift. That's a shift in thinking, right? All of these responses are tied to this model. So as you answer the question, you can see if your response is good, bad, or indifferent. So it keeps the score. But the context here is you're in the hospital. You're interacting with physicians. So this is a sales simulation. So you get the right responses, you get the right information, you get the right ideas. So this is showing analytics. We've got a scoreboard for the analytics. So that's the kind of neat thing in this virtual environment. Is called Zombie Sales Apocalypse, which is kind of a funny name, but it is basically that when you sold to somebody, if you had the right conversation with them, everything was fine. If you didn't have the right conversation with them, they slowly became a zombie. And so the idea was you had to have the right answers to the right questions. You had to get the right score on the model. But the important thing here is there's an underlying model that has to be followed. So you want to have the right underlying model so that the learning meets the right outcomes. And that's a goal that you should be thinking about. So how we displayed the model is this way. At the end of the sales evaluation, you see the model, right? There's your sales model mastery. There's an answer to all the, problem identification, knowledge of the, all that kind of stuff. How many sales documents you selected, because you have an opportunity to select sales documents. How many questions you did. Oops, and notice they didn't do very well on questions. But you also have, why does it keep doing this? Sorry. Sales questions. And then here are other, like your session score, your time, your attempts, your energy, your zombie hits. You could get boosts. So all kinds of scores can be calculated. And then using analytics. And now in this particular scenario, one of the interesting things was before you even went into the environment, because remember earlier on, I said, you got to think about how you're going to prep the learner to go into the environment, what the learner is going to have to think about. So here we have questions about what would you do before you went into a sales call. So imagine this, you get described a scenario. The scenario is you have to go into a physician's office. they see these kind of patients, they do this kind of work, all that kind of stuff. So then the question is, how would you approach this call? And then you would say, well, for problem identification, this is what I would do. For knowledge of the client, this is what I would do. For persistence, this is what I would do. For product knowledge, this is what I would do. For professionalism, this is what I would do. So you're getting the learner to pre-think about their activities going into this environment. They're going to predict what they would do or how they would do it. And then here they have to pick up the documents that they're going to do. So you have different documents like white papers, leveraging questions, all that kind of stuff. And the idea is kind of get the learner to think about their experience. And then they actually go into the experience. Whoops, let me back up. So they go into the experience like this. Boom, you're in the experience. You're having the conversation. You're also running away from a zombie, but you can see you're talking to a physician or you're talking to a nurse, like all that kind of stuff. Then after you have written down what you thought you were going to do, then you go through the experience. At the end, you see on the right-hand side here, here's what a professional would have done versus on the left, what you said you were going to do. So on the left-hand side is what you said you were going to do. I'm going to ask probing questions. I'm going to check the CRM to recall details. I'm going to remember that the HCP is highly data driven. I'm going to remember all that. And then on the right, okay, what would the expert do? And it tells you what the expert did. So the advantage of this is you predict or think about the learning experience, you go through the experience, and at the end, you think about and reflect upon it. Remember earlier I said there's no learning without reflection, only experience. This is the opportunity for the virtual reality environment to give you, if there's not a human involved, right? There's no coach, it's all self-paced. It gives you the feedback that you would have gotten from an expert. So it's one way to create an environment that allows a learner to really think deeply about the experience and then reflect on the experience. And you can get analytics based on that as well. So that's really kind of interesting, right? And what we found from the outcome is that the learners described significant and essential learning that they needed, and then they were able to, they identified that up front. They went through the experience, they reflected on it. Then the next time they went through, they knew much more. They were much better equipped to think about the sales calls. And we measured the changes in answers of the reps as they moved from level 1 to level 3. So there were 3 different levels. So the first level was just to get them acclimated. So they went through and kind of did the level. And the second and third levels were more of the same, but more difficult. So hopefully they learned and reflected from the first level, and then they were better in the second level. And again, they did the same thing. In the second level, they predicted what they would do given a scenario. They did the e-learning event, or the virtual reality event, and then they debriefed on that event. And that gave them the sense of, oh, okay, this is what I need to do. Okay, this is what an expert would do. Okay, let me try that, apply that at the next level. And so what do I need to think about for the next level? Then have the experience, and then what did I think about? So that gives them that opportunity. So again, it's a realistic call environment. It's got the model on the left so you can see how you're doing in real time. It has the questions that are linked to the model. You interact with different, in this case, healthcare professionals. You can collect collateral material throughout the environment. You have your meters, as I said before. And then at the end, another thing that right before the experts give you your feedback, we want you to reflect in general. And that reflection is in the form of an interview. Remember, you're going into this environment that what we set up is kind of zombies. And, again, they turn into zombies if you don't answer questions correctly during the sales situation. So afterwards, we want you to reflect even more. And again, there's not a person there. So we have these kind of interview. Hey, you were up against zombies. That's a pretty crazy environment. Can you tell us a couple things, right? And then you answered those questions. And then you got the feedback at the end of the expert. So the idea is build in reflection any way you can. It can be, here's what an expert would say. It can be, think about your own answers. In a 3D virtual world, you're having an experience. And sometimes when people have an experience, they don't stop to think about it. And if they don't stop to think about the experience, then the problem is they might not have learned anything. They just had an experience. Oh yeah, that was really fun. It was really cool playing with the radioactive isotopes. It was really cool diagramming. Okay, but what did you learn? I don't know. Well, we need to know. We need to know what you learned. So let's go back and let's look at what you've learned. And that's something that you need to think about as a designer on how are you going to, with this 3D virtual metaverse experience, provide the learner with an opportunity to reflect on the experience they just had. You really need to build in that reflection. And so whenever you do an immersive learning event, you should teach and talk about, hey, this is what you're going to be learning, right? This is where you kind of fill this in, then have the experience, and then do the debrief. And research actually shows this is a very effective methodology for helping learners to learn, right? Teach them, this is what we're going to be talking about. This is what you're going to be experienced. Get ready for it. What do you think you're going to do in that environment? And then give them that environment and then debrief them about the environment. That's a really important way to think about it. Okay, so we've talked a lot about that. And we brushed on tools a little bit last time. I just want to kind of really quickly go over some of the tools that you could use for VR. We're not going to jump. I mean, a lot of these tools are very complicated, but not all of them. So we're going to jump into one or two. But Unity, of course, we talked about that. It's typically, and Anders talked about that. He said, hey, they're kind of moving away from the VR environment and getting more toward, mobile games, because that's, kind of where all the money is for them, because VR kind of, fell away, which is bizarre. It'll be back. VR kind of ebbs and flows. So Unity is one. Another is called O3DE, and it's the open source real-time engine, and it's free. So if you have any inclination about real-time 3D and you want to check it out and you want to build something on your own, this is a really good tool to get started. You have to have some understanding of programming, so it's not a drag and drop, but it's a really good tool for somebody that wants to kind of dabble in it, that knows a little bit about programming, a little bit about development, and getting it from that perspective. Blender also, it's free software that you can play with. It's great for rendering and modeling and sculpting and kind of creating 3D environment. So this is another good place to look and to experiment with. Another one, as Anders said, Unreal Engine. It's been around since I want to say the beginning of time, but at least since my academic career started, Unreal Engine has been around as a really good tool. So that's probably a good place if you wanted to get into the development side of it. A place to start is Unreal, because as Anders said, a lot of development is moving in that direction. But as an instructional designer, there are tools like LearnBright, and we're going to do LearnBright. And LearnBright basically is a drag and drop 3D environment. And it doesn't look as cool as Unreal or Blender stuff, or it's close to the open source real time or Unity, right? It looks a little bit more cartoony from the graphics perspective. But from an everyday use perspective, it's a pretty powerful tool, because you can create with pre-built assets very quickly a 3D virtual environment. And the advantage of that, of course, is that you don't have to know how to program. You just grab it together, you add some. Now, it's a little bit a combination of 3D and I'm sorry, it's a little bit of a combination of drag and drop and you have to know a little bit of programming if you want to do the higher end kind of stuff. But for basics and for getting started, it's definitely a tool that we're going to look into, and it's definitely a tool that can provide you some pretty powerful elements. So keep in mind LearnBright, go and check it out. Actually, if we go here, let me go here. Yeah, so learnbright.com. And this is the LearnBright environment. And the cool thing is you can get a free trial. So you can click on it. And this is what we are going to do. I'm going to ask you to do this, is to go in, and I'll have another video on that. But you can put your first name, last name, your email, and create a free account and just kind of check it out. And so that's what I want you to do. I want you to go into LearnBright. I want you to create a free account, and I want you to check it out. It's very simple to create it. If you are having any kind of trouble, let me know. But you can go ahead and do that as well. And I just think it's a very powerful tool for allowing you to do some really powerful things. So I'm already signed in. So here's the kind of things that I think is interesting. So for example, if I wanted a hospital, I could just click on hospital, and in a hospital environment, and I can move things around. I can add things. I can do all kinds of really interesting things. Like here, I've got some people in there. This is a bot, so Sharon's not a real person. Now in LearnBright, you move. Yeah, I have a bad internet connection, of course. Story of my life. But I can move around in 3D. See my character. And the cool thing is, you know, I don't move by walk. I move by the blue squares. And you might say, well, yeah, I don't like that, Dr. Kopp, like the blue squares. I don't know about that. But I have found that by clicking on them, people are much more, who are not familiar with VR, are much more comfortable with that. They get less vertigo, that kind of stuff. But not just a hospital. I can go to like all kinds of rooms. Like here's like kind of a cool fantasy room, so I can check out this. And a student a while back created a room like this and put in all kinds of interesting things where you can go from place to place. So let's let this is rendering. So it's rendering a little bit slow, but we'll let it render. And here's again the environment. 3D environment. So what I would like you to do is go into LearnBright, and I can go to the night. I have to be, you know, he's challenging me. I could get cut. And then I have like messages here. Remember how I talked about the world talking to you? So here's a note where the world can talk to me. And then I have more notes. This is a scavenger hunt. This is a 3D virtual scavenger hunt.
Note.
I can click on other things as well. So this is kind of a lesson about gamification in the 3D world, which is, I think, really kind of interesting. And so you can do all kinds of things with this. You can even, you know, you can create worlds, spaces, scenarios, bots. Like you can click on bots, for example. And I'll let you play with this, but yeah, here we go. The bots example is pretty cool as well. You can create a new bot. You can add different items to your bot, you know, your name, your description, but then you can also create, you know, ears, right? I want a left diamond left stud. Boom, I got a diamond left stud in my ear. I can change my face if I wanted to, right? I don't like face 1. I can do face 5, right? So you have all kinds of different faces, and this is the customization that I was talking about. You can do eyebrow pierce. I mean, it's just crazy what you know, you can be thinking. The elements that you can do with this tool is just pretty amazing. Let me think about this. So anyway, what I want you to do is go into LearnBright, click on free trial, and then once you get the free trial, go ahead and put in your first name, last name, and your best email. Click on create your free account. and you will be able to create your free account and check out LearnBright. So enjoy that. It's I think very interesting, and you should have a lot of fun with that. Now, another place that I think is interesting is Turbo Squid, which I cannot remember if I mentioned this last time or not, but if so, you can just fast forward through this. But Turbo Squid will allow you for very inexpensively to buy models. So if I want a hospital bed, I can click on that and it's going to find me a hospital bed or hospital equipment. And then for $139, I can download this. And then I can import it into something like LearnBright, or I could import it into Unreal Engine, or I can import it into, so the need to have a 3D modeler to create everything has been greatly reduced, which is fantastic because it allows you to really expand 3D. So the costs are coming down, 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 and it's really nice to do that. So I can do, let's do tow truck, right? Maybe I'm doing some tow truck training. Wow, like, okay, what tow truck do you want? You know, like take your pick. You know, this one looks fairly realistic, heavy duty tow truck. This one, Ford tow truck. So you can see some really good models if you want that you could just download. Again, relatively inexpensively. Here's all the information about the format. Here's all the information about the textures, the downloadability of it, the prices, all that kind of stuff. And here's construction, right? Boy, how long would it take a 3D modeler to create a whole home construction? But you don't have to. You simply purchase it here. Oh, well, how much would that cost? Well, let's go down and kind of take a look here, and we can see $34. I mean, amazing, right? $34. So this kind of tells you some of the abilities that you have. TurboSquid, kind of amazing. So that is for now the content I wanted to talk to you about virtual experiences. So we've covered in this presentation a lot. We've discovered how we take the ADDIE model and we add it to VR. We talked a little bit about when to use VR for learning experiences. We talked about different tools to use for VR. So all of this we need to think about when we go into VR experience. And we talked about LearnBright diving in and going into that VR experience. So enjoy the instruction and look forward to seeing you next week in class. Take care, everybody.